Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, Help Improve Organization Performance with Internal Audits. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
Thank you everyone for joining us today, and I'm pleased to introduce our presenter from Moss Adams, Mark Steranka, Partner and National Practice Leader. And Mark, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Emily, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on your time zone. We have a great audience for today's webinar. I think we have representatives from over 29 states across the U.S., lots of different functions, of course, accounting and finance is well represented. So the goal really today is to give you some practical insights relative to how internal audit functions can work for your organization and how they can have a meaningful impact. I think we will try to present kind of an innovative approach, certainly a holistic approach. In my role at Moss Adams, I get the benefit of getting to work with a lot of different types of organizations on a day-to-day basis, city and counties, special purpose districts, states, higher education institutions, tribes, not-for-profits. So we get to see a lot of different environments, get to see what works, what doesn't work quite as well as one might want. And so we want to bring some of those insights to you, things that you can consider and put into action within your organizations. So as I mentioned, really this is about just practical ideas. The role of internal audit, it understandably tends to be put into a couple of buckets. Are they kind of the cops within the organization, which is kind of not the role that internal audit would want to aspire to. They're looked at maybe not as cops to a degree better, but they're the ones who are really looking at compliance and internal controls. And while that's all good stuff, and I would say that's kind of the historical or traditional approach to internal audit, and what we want to get you thinking about is kind of a broader utilization or application of internal audit that can help the organization more holistically, because all that it really should be about is helping your organization do better tomorrow what it's doing today. And for all of us, that's achieving our mission, our vision, our goals. This happens to be through the quote-unquote internal audit door, but there's lots of things you can do within that to help use internal audit to help improve your organization. So those are the types of things we're going to try to focus on. So really 3 primary topics for today. So components of a holistic internal audit program, how do you get ideas in terms of what you should focus on, where do we see the most common and most impactful improvement opportunities, how do you efficiently and effectively track what's happening within internal audit activities to keep decision makers informed, and making sure that you're making progress, some proven approaches or what we call best practices, just some ideas within how you would execute and get meaningful information out of an internal audit program, and then close with some keys to success. I know it was mentioned you can submit questions via the chat functionality. Encourage you to do that. If we get good questions during the course of the presentation, Emily will give me an alert and we'll address them real time, and also try to save some time at the end for some questions. So let's get in, but I guess we're going to start with our first polling question, and I think we're going to get most of these. I think we have 4 out of the way pretty quickly, so bear with us as we do that. So first question, do you have an internal audit program? Let's just get a sense of the percentage of organizations on the webinar. So a simple yes, no, or I don't know. If you do not see the submit button on your screen, you might just need to scroll down, but please make your selection and hit the submit button, or your response will not be acknowledged by the system. You have to hit submit. So I'll give us a few more seconds to let those selections come in, make sure everyone's paying attention. So let's see what we got. So about 56% yes of an internal audit program, about 40% no, and about 4 to 5% I don't know. So for those of you who do, hopefully we can give you some ideas to enhance them. For those of you who don't have an internal audit program, hopefully we can give you some good ideas that might spur pursuing one in the future. So the first area we're going to talk about is components of an internal audit program, and a holistic internal audit program. We'll focus on 3 primary topics. So inputs. So again, what are sources of information that should inform and drive the activities that are conducted within an internal audit program? Secondly, what do we see as the primary opportunities for improvement? So you get this information through various sources in terms of what we should be focusing on as we're addressing things related to risks and controls and compliance and performance. What are the things that are sort of commonly rising to the top, or themes across the organizations we get the opportunity to work with? And then, as I mentioned before, some ideas on how to efficiently and effectively track and report. I always think of counselor board members who say, how do we know we're making progress? And, we don't just want reports and to go on the shelf. How do we know that things are happening, that management and staff are implementing recommendations and addressing findings? So we'll touch on that a bit. But before we do, our second polling question, this is really a follow-on to the first one. And so does your organization, if you have an internal audit program, would you characterize it as holistic, meaning it's touching various aspects, risks, controls, and performance, or do you view it as more traditional and maybe narrower? And so yes or no, that you view it as holistic. And if you don't have an internal audit program, also you can select we do not have an internal audit program. Again, just a reminder to scroll down on your screen if you should have to find the submit button. And I'll give you a few more seconds here to make your selections. So let's see what we got. So about 40% offer what I would consider kind of something leaning more towards a more holistic internal audit program. 16% no, and then 43% we don't have one. So that kind of mirrors what we had on the previous slide, which is great because that means people are being consistent. So again, I would say for those who have a more robust internal audit program, hopefully what we can provide is just maybe some tweaks, some enhancements to it to make it even that much better. And for those who don't, again, give you ideas of how you can elevate that program to have more impact on your organization. Okay, so let's get into some of the meat of it. So we're going to talk about 3 kind of key sources of information that you should be gathering to inform your internal audit program. So enterprise assessments, we're going to talk about a couple of types. Performance metrics, which is not your typical source of input for internal audit. But when we talk about performance and ability to impact performance of your organization, of course, what better source to gain insights about how to improve performance would be key metrics that hopefully your organization would be tracking or could track in the future. And then what would be considered just as kind of a standard best practice is an ethics or fraud, waste, and abuse hotline as a source for input both from employees and the communities or stakeholders or clients that you serve. Let's first talk about enterprise assessments. So I'm sure we all, in terms of internal audit, hear about risk assessments being something that is kind of a foundational input to internal audit programs. And as well they should. And most organizations do enterprise risk assessments on a fairly cursory level, especially those who do an annual risk assessment, which on one hand is a really great practice. Those risk assessments tend to be fairly surface level. So you don't necessarily get a lot of insight, but it helps you to calibrate your internal audit program each year based on what you learned from the risk assessment. A couple things to think about with an enterprise risk assessment. Again, we're thinking across the whole organization, i.e. enterprise. We're usually thinking about their 15 to 20 kind of primary functions across an organization. We have many of them listed here in the left-hand column. And what you're, of course, trying to do is getting a sense of the risk environment. And later in the webinar, we're going to talk about what a risk assessment actually should consist of. And so we'll kind of give you a profile there. But okay, one foundational input to what we should be focusing on internal audit. And usually one facet of those 15 to 20 functions is internal controls. But since internal controls play such a prominent role and should play such a prominent role historically and moving forward in activities of internal audit, well, then can't we also take a more holistic look at internal controls? So what we're calling here an enterprise internal controls review. So looking at key controls across your organization, again at an enterprise level, looking at them from a effectiveness of design or design effectiveness standpoint. So what does that mean? Are policies in place, procedures in place? Do processes look like they match policies and procedures? How is technology being utilized? So not what is the effectiveness yet of those controls, sort of the impact, but are the controls there? Are they even in place? So is the design there? And then like an enterprise risk assessment, that again can really give you an organization-wide sort of picture of the landscape and give you a good idea of where to lend your focus and at what depth to lend your focus. So, for example, hey, you might be totally solid in payroll, up-to-date policies, processes match it, leveraging technology, highly automated, et cetera, and we feel really good about that. And then we might think about another area of cash handling, a very decentralized activity, and we may see that, procedures may be out of date. They vary across components of the organization, get a sense of inconsistency in terms of how cash is handled. You might say, okay, that's an area that might deserve more focus or a deeper dive in terms of assessing controls design. But that's what you, like the risk assessment, you want to get a sense of the organization to prioritize where to focus your energy. So before we go to our second sort of source of information, just to get a sense again of the organization, has your organization conducted an enterprise risk assessment in the past 3 years? No judgment on how comprehensive it was, just the fact that one was conducted in the last 3 years. So again, yes, no, or I don't know. And again, scroll down if you need to. And while you're doing that, I'll just mention, again, what we see is the typical sort of frequency of risk assessments is anywhere from annually to every 5 years. The reason we ask about in the past 3 years is that's kind of typically where we tend to focus, and then that's kind of give or take a year, depending on how dynamic the environment is of the organization, i.e. how much change are they undergoing. And what an every 3-year cycle enables you to do is dive deeper on the risk assessment each time you do it versus on a more kind of surface level, as I was mentioning. So let's see what we've got for results. So about 40% yes in the past 3 years, about 37% no, and about 23% I don't know. So, good, interesting feedback. Opportunity there for certainly for using a risk assessment more strategically for your organizations. So let's shift to performance metrics. Again, a fairly uncommon sort of driver of internal audit activities, but again, in a kind of in a holistic internal audit environment, performance, think of it as operational efficiency and effectiveness, or basically how well you're able to deliver your services, achieve your mission, vision, and goals, is a great place to have focus. What would be key input for that? Performance metrics. So what are some things to think about performance metrics that are going to be helpful and beneficial to use? Well, they should tie to your strategic plan. So most organizations, but not all, have a strategic plan, a formal one, but all organizations can certainly articulate to some degree, what they're trying to accomplish, of course. And so what things would you need to measure to be able to determine, is your organization being successful in achieving its mission? And so given the types of organizations that are on this webinar, very community and stakeholder focused, whether we're higher ed with delivering education, whether we're a city or not-profit delivering services or a wide range of services to communities and stakeholders, those metrics should reflect what we're trying to accomplish on their behalf. The best form of those are outcomes. What impact are we trying to have on the communities, the clients, the stakeholders that we're serving, and having a sense of that level of success in where within our organization are we not achieving the level of success that we want to, and therefore what could we do about that from an efficiency, from an effectiveness standpoint. And then there are just literally efficiency and effectiveness measures, so costs per X, per service, per person, per customer, the amount of services being delivered in a period of time, or most of us are not really in the product environment, but certainly some of the things we're delivering, if we're talking about paving streets, for example, you could think of that, excuse me, in terms of a product. But what metrics are going to give us a sense of how are we doing as an organization, and therefore where the opportunities for improvement exist, and how can we use internal audit in terms of activities to address those. And then third, ethics hotline, kind of just the standard best practice, but think of it as helpful not only to have in place just as a mechanism for your employees or your communities, customer stakeholders to have a safe, confidential avenue to express a concern, which is a good thing, but just having it in place tends to get people more attuned to that way of thinking. So another term for ethics hotline, fraud, waste, and abuse. So educating your organizations about what is fraud, waste, and abuse, and just the mere fact that you have a hotline in place and they're aware of it just sort of elevates the front of mind thinking about those types of topics. So how do these typically work? Again, they're for both your employees and your external audiences as a mechanism to report things of concern. Typically, but not always, you have a third-party entity who actually provides the hotline, the mechanism for those reports to be received. And typically, but not always, those reports then are directed to internal audit, your internal audit function, whether it's internal or external, and that internal audit function assesses those concerns, those reports, and either decides to deal with them directly or navigates or directs them to the appropriate personnel within the organization. But the benefit we have is a confidential, anonymous, if chosen, mechanism, and it's just a safe way to be able to gain inputs. People usually just typically they'll think of Ethics Hotline as, oh, it's just a source of complaints and you deal with those complaints at the time. Well, that's true, but also they serve as a source of trends. Are we getting complaints or concerns of a particular nature? Does that give us a reason to think about, hey, we may have lack of clarity of policies or procedures, or our processes don't appear to be as streamlined or as efficient as we think they could be, or are there controls that may not be in place or working the way that we want them to? And so an ethics hotline also serves as kind of a true input of ideas in terms of things that you might want to focus on in your internal audit program. So third, I think of 4 polling questions, and I think our 4th one is up pretty soon. So another easy question, or easy to answer, does your organization have an ethics hotline? Again, yes, no, or I don't know. And while I'm giving you a little bit of time to respond, to give you a sense of, from our experience, what sort of the typical breakdown of types of reports received through an ethics hotline goes something like this. 45 to 50% of those reports have nothing to do with your organization. Someone's lost their credit card, they think their identity's been stolen, the cable person keeps soliciting them, just things that they have issues with, but things that don't happen to have anything to do with your organization. Second category, in essence, another 45 to 50% are things that have to do with your organization, but it's just something that you would deal with during the regular course of business. It's a personnel issue, it's an operational issue, it's something that, if internal audit receives it, is able to disseminate it to someone else in the organization to deal with. And then the last 0 to 10%, so a very small portion, is actually something that has relevance to fraud, waste, and abuse. So something internal audit function would actually look into, and typically a very, again, small percentage of those turns out to be something that's actually legitimately fraud, waste, and abuse that warrants investigation. You could still determine that it ends up not being fraud, waste, or abuse, but it's something upon initial discovery, say, yeah, there could be something here, we better dive deeper, and you actually pursue it from an internal audit sort of investigation standpoint. So give you a typical sort of profile. So results here, roughly almost 50% have an ethics hotline. That's great. Just about 40% don't, and about 10 or 11% don't know. So I'd say that's fairly typical. I probably would have guessed that we'd be in the 30 to 50% range for those saying yes, and certainly came in there. So improvement opportunities. So we're going to talk about 3 primary topics: risks, internal controls and compliance, and then third, performance. So what do we see in working with organizations in each of those categories? It's kind of the top or commonalities, themes in terms of opportunities for improvement, and why. So from a risk perspective, okay, we got the baby boomer effect. We have a lot of people still leaving the workforce, and then the environment, the industry, the type of organizations that are represented on this webinar. We typically have longer tenured people. People stick around. So what does that mean? We have more institutional knowledge built into our people because they've been here longer with the organizations. When they leave, it's going to be a bigger impact. If we don't have our policy and procedure environment in a robust state, that gives us that much more exposure or risk that knowledge is going to walk out the door. And so that's something that we're all, in every industry is dealing with that, but certainly within the public sector industry, which, you know, typically, for example, is offering good benefits, retirement, people are incentivized to stick around in their career and do, and so that accentuates the things that we want to do to protect the knowledge that exists within those individuals. Asset management. So this is still kind of a recovery from the Great Recession. Excuse me, so are we able to commit the funds to protect our assets across our organization? How well are we assessing the condition on an ongoing basis? Do we have replacement schedules? Again, are we able to properly fund it? That's a challenge for most organizations. The reason I mentioned the Great Recession is, you know, that had a big impact on reserves. So reserves were drawn down, and so our ability to replace assets was made more difficult, and we tend to extend the life of assets. So a risk to the organizations, because those tend to be larger expenditures. Part of the impact of not being able to invest in our assets as much as we want to is we tend to have larger deferred maintenance programs. So we're not able to also get to things on as frequent a basis from maintenance sometimes because of budget limitations. We have the sort of ripple effect of capital assets, then we're extending the life, which impacts maintenance costs. And so do we have a deferred maintenance list? And if we do, it's probably a relatively healthy size one. And so what does that mean in terms of risk for the organization? Technology. I feel like almost every organization we work with is either implementing a new ERP system or thinking about implementing a new ERP system. We all know how much effort that is. Risks come along with it. And it's not just implementation of the system itself, which is difficult and time-consuming enough, but is the organization prepared for it, both in the people preparing, but policies, process, procedures, or do we have that in a state that we know how we want this new system to operate and how our policies, procedures, processes may need to adjust with a new system. So lots of impacts on the organization. Again, we can sort of tie this a little bit back in terms of workload relative to technology, or why maybe it seems like so many organizations are implementing ERP systems now is we had the Great Recession. You know, we all tightened our belts in a lot of different ways. We've been, you know, gradually and steadily financially improving since then. So now we're getting back around to being able to make investments in things that we maybe put off. And so we have a little bit of a wave of those coming. And then in a way, it kind of goes without saying governance and management as a risk in terms of turnover. So we could throw into the word politics, how stable those environments do, how often do philosophies changing, especially as we're talking about elected and appointed officials. But layering into that, it is an employee's marketplace. The economy is good. Competition from people is fierce. And so turnover or recruiting and retention are that much more of a challenge today, certainly than they were 5 years ago. So how are we dealing with that? And in a way that takes us full circle to the first item, succession. But again, we're seeing these challenges across the organizations that we get the chance to work with. So controls and compliance. So here really just want to get us thinking about centralized activities versus decentralized activities. What we typically see is from a central standpoint, so think of, finance and accounting, that from a control standpoint, more likely than not, we're in a stronger position there. This is where we're focused. This is where we're developing our policies and procedures. Maybe they need to be updated, but they're more typically than not in place. But we kind of have our arms, for the most part, around what's happening centrally, for the mere fact that it's kind of right there within arm's length. We're close to it. We've got an eye on it. All of our organizations obviously have decentralized activities in terms of services, but we think of terms of controls, which we tend to think of from a financial and accounting standpoint, but they don't just reside within accounting and finance. They reside in the decentralized activities that happen out within our departments, our other facilities, our other campuses. And so how do we focus on making those decentralized controls and compliance with those in our policies as strong as they are centrally? And so what we see are typically opportunities, we've listed some here which tend to have traditionally sort of decentralized in both centralized and decentralized activities or components. Is what we're looking for is centrally, do we have strong and complete policies and procedures? Are they disseminated out to the decentralized activities? Do we provide training on those policies and procedures? Do we provide guidance in how to apply them, coaching on that? Are we doing any oversight or monitoring of adherence to those? Do we see in some of the decentralized activities where they have supplemental policies and procedures to address some of the things that are unique to their operations? And usually where the opportunities exist are, and it's probably kind of stating the obvious, it's the disconnects or the inconsistencies that we see across decentralized activities versus the centralized. And so how do we bridge those gaps and get those operating more synonymously, more consistently across the organization? So the things that I mentioned, policies and procedures, guidance, training, oversight, are all things that are going to help pull that closer together to converge versus diverge. And all the organizations that we work with are challenged in that regard. And all the organizations that we work with are not fully up to date on their policies and procedures. I mean, it's not the sexiest thing to work on. We all have our regular jobs. And so, but those are all, they're opportunities for improvement. And then finally, if we talk about performance, so we talked about some of this in terms of metrics, but how do we really get this working in a way that's providing insightful input to an internal audit program? And so what can we focus on, or what are the opportunities to focus on to help make that a more meaningful source of information? So one is top list outcomes, is getting your organizations really focused on what outcomes you're trying to achieve. So think of outputs and outcomes. Outputs is what you do, and outcomes are what the impact of that is. It's obviously easier to define, measure, and develop sort of targets for outputs than it is for outcomes, but we're all in the business to achieve outcomes. So going through the process of trying to define those outcomes, what to measure to assess progress in achieving those outcomes, what are our targets 3, 5, 7 years into the future relative to those outcomes, and what do we need to be doing in each facet of our organization to achieve those. Similarly, at the same time or in parallel, thinking about efficiency. How can we deliver the services that we are today more efficiently? And that doesn't mean do the same or more with less. That means how can we do be the best stewards of dollars as we can be to deliver as much service as we can for the resources that we have. So thinking about, again, cost per head, cost, per FTE, cost per customer, per capita, per service, but where are we today, point X, and how much more efficient could we be in the future, and establish those targets and work towards those. I've mentioned policies and procedures. Again, that's one of the most common areas that our organizations need to improve, just because there's so many of them. It's not the most fun thing to work on. We put it here under performance because obviously having them in place are drivers of performance. And sometimes your practices are out in front of your policies and procedures, meaning we've adjusted our practices over time. We haven't gone back to update our policies and procedures to reflect how we actually operate, or sometimes, of course, is vice versa, that we're not actually adhering to our policies and procedures fully, even though they are up to date. Financial transparency, it's probably a term we're all, in a way, a little bit sick of, but thinking about the opportunity there is just how do we convey that more effectively? And I know this area is kind of overused in focus, but just some simple concepts like just thinking about if you took a dollar bill, and how would you break up that dollar bill for both your employees, but certainly your external audiences, and demonstrate to them or be able to educate them on what are the various sources and how much do they contribute to supplying, so the revenue side of that dollar. And then if you broke it up, what would be the expenditure components? And so for every dollar spent, what does it go to? And just building that understanding. Of course, performance measures and efficiency and effectiveness are going to be parts of transparency and being good stewards, especially of public dollars, but just doing a better job of educating them about sort of how the system works, how your organization works, and the inflow and the outflow also can go a long way. And then probably the area that's sort of the least tapped, but really in a way the most effective, and if you want to be successful in item 1, community outcomes, you need to be successful in item 5, employee engagement, and how you can get your employees literally more engaged in their roles and contributing to achieving the outcomes. So think of it as, am I coming in, punching the clock, doing my thing and going home, or am I really focused on I'm having an impact, whether big or small, on helping our organization achieve its mission, vision, and goals? And how would I know that I'm doing that? And engaging your employees in a way that creates that connectivity. So final element of kind of components are reporting and tracking. Again, kind of like policies and procedures or working on them, maybe doesn't feel like the most exciting thing, but just some practical examples for you from clients that we work with. So here one, and I know you can't probably read all the detail, and it's not necessarily intended for that, but here's a summary page of active projects, internal audit projects for a particular client, when they were completed, how many findings were in them, how many findings have been completed, how many findings have been validated. So what do those 3 things mean? So you conduct a project under internal audit, an audit that has 10 findings, so 10 findings and recommendations. Management ideally would have an implementation plan saying, here's how we plan to address those 10 recommendations. They may decide to implement all 10. They may decide, hey, we think 8 of these are priority we're going to focus on. We may do them slightly different than how recommended. The recommendations aren't a Bible or prescription of what you have to do. They're what they are, recommendations. But having an implementation plan, and then what you can have, and this occurs in some cases and not all cases, are those findings validated. What do we mean by validated? that the corrective actions taken by management actually address the findings. So let's say it's updating a policy or procedure. So on one hand, was the policy or procedure updated? Yes, but did the change in policy or procedure actually address the gap, the deficiency, whether it's a control or clarification or something that didn't exist, and validating that, yes, that will have the impact needed to address the issue. So yes, did you do it, and yes, is it going to actually fix it? And then so identifying in this particular summary page how many new findings were completed. And then if we give you sort of the supporting information behind that, this would be an excerpt from one of, and this is just done in Excel, so simple to do, both the summary page and this one. This is an excerpt from one of the reports or audits, the findings, the recommendations. Again, I know you can't read this because it's too small. Who's responsible? What's the target timing for implementation? What the actual corrective action is. So the findings, recommendations, and corrective actions are the one with all the sort of the content in there. And then, was it completed? Yes, no, partially. When was it completed? And then whether there was validation or not. The ones that are highlighted in yellow, and this are just some examples of, in this particular report to an audit committee, those were in this particular audit, the two new ones that were completed versus ones priorly completed. So the audit committee can see it, understand what was done, and make sure that they feel like that was the right action, and then they can instruct internal audit to do any validation if they so choose. But just easy mechanisms to keep people informed. A, again, just so you can demonstrate progress. B, so that you can being able to report what that progress is and have a record of it without making a big effort to do. So I'm going to shift gears to some particular facets of things that we've talked about, examples to, again, help you with kind of tools or practical approaches. So I'm going to talk a little bit about risk assessment. So I mentioned before about trying to take a comprehensive approach. You may have heard the term heat maps. A lot of times risk assessments, organizations like to display them in a heat map format. I tend to like to do it this way because it facilitates comparisons. So what are we showing here? There's, I think, 17 risk factors that were addressed in this particular enterprise risk assessment. You see the results from 2013, what the risk levels were in each of these 17 areas. If they were numbered instead of letters, you could tell it's 17. In 2016, the risk assessment update, you can see in this case how much progress was made, which is great. And so we get that comparison. And then separately, we get just for 2016, not only the risk assessment, and the same was provided for 2013, but just showing it in this case for 2016, what the trajectory was. And so you might say, well, what do you mean about trajectory? Isn't a risk assessment done at a point in time? And yes, technically it is, but a point in time is the equivalent of done in a vacuum. And so, or at least that's what I would say. And so trajectory gives you the added element of, okay, you're seeing accounting and financial reporting. The first one is at moderate to high risk. But what are we trending to higher risk? Are we trending to lower risk? Are we trending to flat or about steady state? And I'm a decision maker. Give me some sense. Are we headed in the right direction or the wrong direction? This trajectory has nothing to do with the change from 2013 to 2016. This is specifically the trajectory at the point in time in 2016 of that risk assessment or risk categorization for that particular function. So it's just an added piece of information of where we're headed, because the same risk level increasing versus decreasing trajectory obviously would tell me different things and make me think about different courses of action relative to that level of risk. And then another really insightful way to look at risk assessments is to get a comparison of the assessment or rating that internal audit is preparing, which is what was reflected on the previous slide, to what management's perspective is. So in a risk assessment, you're of course talking to management as part of that process to assess risks. In fact, that's one of the most important inputs to assessing risks. But ultimately, the internal audit function provides their assessment of risk based on inputs, review of documents, observing operations, interviews with management. So that goes in internal audit's risk assessment. What we also like to do is then conduct a survey, typically do it online, so very simple. And getting them to assess the risk themselves gives you a sense of how much of alignment do you have between management's perspective and our perspective, or internal audit's perspective. And what's really interesting there is typically what the result is, they tend to think the same areas that are high risk or higher risk compared to others as internal audit, so kind of have the same perspective or relational perspective, but typically also view risks lower than what internal audit does. And some of that's kind of be expected. It's where you have big disconnects that you start to say, okay, is there an opportunity for management to better understand risks, risk management, how to assess risks, how to mitigate risks, and so sometimes you get that educational opportunity, but that comparison is interesting. Last comment on risks is, I mentioned kind of surface level versus more detailed. So here's an example of what would go into a more detailed or robust risk assessment, one that you could do every 3 years. And think of risk assessment, it shouldn't be just for the purpose of internal audit informing an internal audit program. It should be a standalone tool for management, elected and appointed officials to use to make decisions. So how do you make it robust enough to support decision making? So yes, you have risk level, so level of uncertainty. Yes, you typically base that on likelihood of risk happening and impact, sort of two components that drive the risk level. But as I mentioned already, adding risk trajectory, and then not just having a rating, but really have a detailed discussion of, so take asset management. What is the asset management environment in the organization? What are the assets? What are the values of them? What are the conditions of them? What's the projected forecasted need? What's the projected forecasted ability to address that need? Really painting a picture that informs decision making that isn't just a rating, but you tell a story. And then you can add to that, and so whatever the risk level is, what are mitigating actions that you could take to reduce that risk? And if those mitigating actions were implemented, what would be the potential residual risk? So now you've really conveyed a comprehensive look at risk for a particular function that really can inform decisions for a multi-year period. So much more insightful than just saying HR is high risk. Okay, controls. So what I was going to tackle here for controls is, so this is again is sort of the more traditional area of focus of internal audit. You're going to tend to have over time probably a massive, quite a number of findings for controls, which isn't a bad thing. Those are opportunities for improvement and things that will be addressed over time. But if you have a decent number of them, how do you get your arms around them in a practical way? Because there are going to be wide ranges of how you're going to address them. And, I mentioned the ERP earlier, and lots of organizations going through ERPs, which are going to have significant impacts on controls by definition. So organizing controls findings in ways that reflects really what action you're going to take, and that's what we've shown here. So you're going to have some that they're just things that you can do tomorrow. They're easy, kind of they're early wins. You don't need approval. You just need to go get it done. So that's a category. Next one, you're going to have ones that are going to take time. It might be years to implement, especially when they're tied to an ERP. And that doesn't mean there couldn't be things that you do in the interim, but in terms of a full solution to some of them, they're going to be often years, and so define them that way. Guaranteed you're going to have a whole bunch that are going to fall into the update or develop policies and procedures. Group them and organize them that way, and we're doing this both from facilitating implementation, but communicating to your audit committee, your board and council, when they're saying, well, geez, you have all these findings, what are you going to do about them? Well, here's how we're organizing them. You're going to have some that are going to require training, and so you may have a training scheduled out 6 months that's going to enable you to tick off a whole bunch of findings, but it's going to take until that time to do it. And then you're going to have some that you'll address just through additional activities within internal audit. For example, testing, doing sampling and testing. That will be a way to address certain things. So organizing it in a way that your audience is going to understand, organizing in a way that's going to facilitate practical implementation. And then third on metrics, again, so think of metrics at kind of multiple levels. You have at your kind of strategic planning, community, stakeholder level, the outcomes you're trying to achieve. And then at a secondary level, kind of think of your departmental level or enterprise level, things that you need to do as an organization from a program delivery, from a service delivery, from an efficiency standpoint, that you're going to kind of take a holistic look. And then you're going to get down into your departmental programmatic level, so kind of 3 tiers. And I'm going to kind of focus us in on kind of the connection between sort of the top 2 tiers. And that is, you mentioned outcomes before. Here's an example from the strategic goals of one of our municipal clients. Their areas of focus, you can see public safety, fiscal sustainability, economic development, et cetera, as well as efficiency and effectiveness, the things that they're going to be focused on to see if they are achieving their mission, vision, and goals. So how would this help you from an internal audit standpoint? So think of reserve balance or retail vacancy rate, and I know these are all different things, pavement condition rating, employee turnover. If you're seeing performance in those areas suboptimal to what you're trying to achieve, then you can say, okay, well, what could we be doing about impacting the organization to turn those around? So if it's your reserve balance, so maybe we're not operating as efficiently as we can. How can we create more reserves? Or how can we increase the top line? How can we bring in more revenue? Can we improve AR? Can we be updating our fees and charges? So, how do we tackle these? If it's pavement condition rating, how are we operating within public works? What is getting in the way of us achieving a better rating? Are we able to pave as many miles as we want in the way that we want? Is it equipment? Is it people? Is it process? Is it approvals that could be getting in the way? And what are things that we could do through internal audit to help identify those and identify solutions to those? And then if we talk about efficiency and effectiveness, what trend line are we on in terms of our costs? Are our costs going up per FTE for HR, IT, finance, legal, our support services, or cost per our customer or capita for the services that we're delivering? Are they going up or going down? If they're going up, what can we be doing in terms of trying to achieve more efficiency? So again, just kind of think of it as a spotlight of areas then we can go within internal audit and give some attention to find opportunities for improvement. So I'm going to bring us into the home stretch here so we can leave some time for questions. Again, just relative to the ethics hotline, just thinking of it again from a perspective of it's not just putting a hotline in place. Hey, we've got a 1-800 number. Now we have a mechanism for people to express concerns both within and external to the organization. think of it as a program. This is ethics or fraud, waste, and abuse. That's an opportunity to educate your organization to understand what fraud, waste, and abuse is, their role in preventing it, what they can do on a day-to-day basis, just making how they make decisions, following processes, seeing things, see something, say something. But it's really about educating them, because Ethics Hotline is just as much about having a conduit to report something. It is as a deterrent for someone to know, oh, there is a conduit for this. People are thinking about this, people are looking for it. Maybe I need to be more careful or more diligent about how I do what I do. So it's a deterrent as well as a mechanism to report things, in that we're protecting confidentiality in this process, retaliation, whistleblower. But think of it as a program, not just that we're putting a number out there for someone to call. And then very last comments, just again, some philosophy kind of about internal audit. If internal audit operates as or is viewed as the cops, the police, we're out to get you, it's not going to be successful, because everyone's going to want to turn the other way when the internal audit function sort of comes around the corner. So yes, of course, internal audit needs to be objective and independent. I would say that goes without saying. And if you're doing it in a comprehensive way or a holistic way, that doesn't necessarily go without saying, but it's a best practice. And if you're addressing risks and controls and performance, then you're having that much more of a bigger impact on the organization. But it's the couple elements in between that really are make or break it, in terms of it still needs, you can be collaborative and objective at the same time. You need to be working, internal audit needs to work with the organization, not on them. You need to engage them. You need to extract their knowledge, their insights, what could work better. And it's like, help me help you. And if you make it collaborative, it's going to be that much more productive. And similarly, if what you convey is done constructively, then they'll want to do it. You don't want to, it's not finger pointing, make someone look bad. If they want to make the changes, if it's conveyed in a constructive way, then you're going to have that much more success. So with that, we're going to see what we have for questions, Emily, in about the 3 minutes we have left.
All right, sounds good. Our first question, does writing or assisting in writing policies or updating policies inhibit independence for internal audit? What can we reasonably do in regards to writing or assisting in the creation of policies?
That's such a great question, and I can't tell you how much that comes up. And there are two very distinct camps of thought in this regard. On one hand, it's you cannot audit your own work, or you shouldn't put yourself in a position, certainly, to audit your own work. So therefore, you can't, you being internal audit, cannot help with policies and procedures. And there are plenty of organizations who take that stance, and I get it. But it's a very limiting stance, and I would submit it's an unnecessary stance. Internal audit can absolutely help with policies and procedures. It always has to be management's decision on what the policy and procedure is and adoption thereof. And if you want to play it safe, internal audit can provide best practices, can provide examples, can help facilitate the process. We do help many of our clients with their policies and procedures, never to the extent where it's our own, but the challenge usually is the client. You're telling me I've got to update and create all these policies and procedures. I don't have the time or resources to do it. How am I ever going to get this accomplished? Can you help? Yes, we can help. We can bring you best practices. We can facilitate the process. We can do population of core content that then the client tailors to themselves. And so there's a lot of help internal audit can and should do, because you don't want to put the organization in a position of, you tell me you've got to do these things, but it's kind of like that unfunded mandate, but I don't have the time or resources to do it. And so there is a happy medium in there when you can do that without jeopardizing your objectivity or independence. So great question. Do you have another one or two?
Yep. Do you have any tips to get senior management to see the value of risk assessment?
Well, so yes, and I think a couple of the things that I mentioned I think would help. So one is and maybe it's one and then 2A and B. So one is if it's done more comprehensively, kind of the way that we described, it's going to provide more value, so they'll view it as more value because you can do it in a way that actually gives them information to make decisions on, versus, again, just being very surface level and saying, hey, this is high, and maybe here's a couple comments why, but not something that they can really use. The second item is, and kind of the A and B of it, is engage them in the process. So if you're not interviewing them and getting their input as part of that, they're not going to value it, and you're not going to benefit from the insights. And then secondly, if you also do a survey to cast a broader net of management and give them the opportunity to, on their own input, and be able to see how they've responded as a group, and seeing some of those trends and differences that we were showing in some of those charts, now you're giving them more value because you're giving them more information, and I think that will help them, quote unquote, view it more valuably. I think we probably need to end there because it just turned to 12:01.
Yep, that is about all we have time for. If you had questions for Mark that we didn't get to today, I will be happy to follow up with you after the webcast, or you can reach out directly to Mark. His contact info is here on this slide. Thank you, Mark, for a great presentation today. And as a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts icon to the right of the slide view. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few more moments to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. And here is a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey, as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next time.